Hi everyone. I realized I wanted to do one more thing with our text adventure game, the one that you've been working on at home for homework, before we leave that one as well. So this week's homework is a large one, so it's not going to be due until Friday. On Wednesday, you are going to be responsible for having implemented some aspects of it, and bringing those into class so that I can check in with everybody to see how you're doing on it. Here's the idea. We have implemented Subclass Sandbox in our in-class graphical adventure game. I would also like to implement that same structure in our homework text adventure game framework, because I think doing it in both contexts is going to reinforce the ideas, and also seeing where it's the same and where it's different is going to be helpful. So, as I say in my homework assignment here, I don't want to give a lot of step-by-step instructions, because part of the goal is you've had these experiences in class, and I want you to be able to realize what you need and put it in there, because the whole goal is for you to be independent, not to have to follow teacher instructions. But I do want to point out a couple of highlights here. So, instead of having a moving entity class which implements Subclass Sandbox, let's call ours enemy. And the two movement methods that I want you to implement are move random and chase player. Move random, whenever it gets run, will move the entity to a random neighboring room. Chase player, what it does is, if the player is not close to the enemy, it doesn't move at all. However, if the player is 2 steps away from the enemy, so in other words, if there's a neighboring room and then one of those neighboring rooms contains the player, then what the enemy will do is it will move to the room that is the one that's 1 step away from the player. So here I describe it a little bit more carefully. So let's say the enemy is in room A, the player is in room N, and A has a neighbor, B, for which N is a neighbor. So it's like 2 steps away. So if that's the situation, the enemy would move from room A to room B, so that now it's only 1 step away from the player. I don't so if the enemy is only 1 step away from the player, it's up to you if you want to move it into the player's room, or if you want to keep it always just 1 move away from the player. I don't care. I just want to see this functionality. Okay. So you should definitely use good design, where you have a class hierarchy. Use abstract if you need to, or if it's good design, and you should put fields and getter and setter methods as high as they need to be. We'll dip into the code in just a second, but we have a game loop that's in main, and it's turn-based. So it's this infinite loop where it asks the player to type a command, and then it executes the command. So we're going to have our enemies move exactly once per loop. So player types a command, the player does something, and then at the same time, all the enemies have the opportunity to do one thing. Obviously, you will need to provide a way for the rooms to hold a list of enemy objects. Let's jump into the code now. So remember, we renamed graph to be level, and inside graph we renamed node to be room. Rooms already have a list of items. I think you also want to give them a list of enemies, because otherwise how does a room know which enemies it contains? You'll also need to provide methods to put enemies into the room, to take enemies out of the room, to get a list of which enemies are in there, to check if a particular enemy is in there, sort of anything that might be helpful. Okay, this part's super important. This is the source of many bugs. So notice that, so an enemy also needs to know what room it's in. So there's sort of 2 variables. Room is going to have a list of enemies, but then enemy is also going to have a room field so that the enemy knows what room it's in. When the enemy moves room, you have to update all of the variables that are relevant. So that's 3 variables. Inside enemy, obviously, if the enemy is changing rooms, then the room variable needs to change. But the room itself, the room that the enemy used to be in, you got to remove the enemy from that list. And then the room that the enemy is entering, you got to add the enemy into that room's list of enemies. So all 3 of those pieces, otherwise there's going to be a lot of bugs. So just having enemies running around isn't good unless the user can see it somehow. So you should add some text display for what enemies are in the room. And obviously you should implement a couple of enemy subclasses. And then let's have a stay command, which will let the user stay in place in a room. So like when they type stay, it just says you stay put. But because the enemies are moving, you can see enemies go into and out of the room that you're just currently standing in. Other nice things to add, you might want to add, like if there is an enemy in an adjacent room, you might want to have it display some message about like you hear some gurgling or something to clue the player into the fact that they're close to an enemy. Okay, that's it.